Przemyśl Fortress was a series of fortifications constructed at Przemyśl by the Austro-Hungarian Empire from the mid-19th century until the First World War. It was constructed in sections, depending on the diplomatic relations between Austria and the Russian Empire, and saw extensive combat during World War I. Originally captured by the Russian army, it was recaptured by the German army in mid-1915. Afterwards, the ruined fortifications lost the military significance. History. Construction. The initial construction plans for 41 entrenchments were drawn up at the beginning of the 19th century. However, good relations between Austria and the Russian Empire meant that construction did not go ahead until 1854 with the outbreak of the Crimean War. 19 of the 41 entrenchments were completed, with 9 more under construction when relations again improved in 1855 and construction was halted. Until 1878, no work was undertaken on the fortress. In 1878, the barracks, magazines and interconnecting roads were completed, as well as 9 earth forts in light of the Bosnian crisis. 3 years later, in 1881, these temporary earthworks were converted into permanent solid fortifications, and by 1910 infantry fortifications had been added. When war broke out in 1914, the fortress was further reinforced with trenches, more barracks and artillery emplacements. After the war, with much of its defences destroyed, the fortress fell into disrepair and no longer had any military significance. The area was fortified again in 1940 with modern bunkers built as part of the Soviet Molotov line. But these new fortifications had little to do with the original Austro-Hungarian fortress. World War I. On the outbreak of World War I, the fortress was only garrisoned by a small force of 5 infantry battalions, artillery and sappers. Defense preparations began on August 2, 1914. The civilians were evacuated on September 4, and the Austro-Hungarian Army's HQ followed on September 15. 2 days later, on September 17, 1914, the Russian army laid siege to the fortress, sealing it off totally by September 26. The siege continued into October, with a truce being offered and subsequently refused on October 5. Bombardment intensified in the next few days, and on October 7 the Russians assaulted the fortress at 3 a.m. The Russians lost 10,000 personnel, 4,000 of them killed, and by October 9 a relief force had pushed them back to the San River. The fortress was later abandoned by all but a small defensive force on November 4 as it was in danger of being outflanked. The remaining troops were left to tie down the Russian forces for as long as possible, and when they were surrounded for a second time they sortied continuously through late November and December. Food shortages through the spring of 1915 led to the butchering of 13,000 horses to feed the garrison, and by March 14, 1915, the outer fortification had been captured and destroyed by the Russian army. At this point, in the face of low food and morale, the fortress commander, General Hermann Kuzmanek von Bergneustadt, decided to break out. His forces, however, were bogged down and repulsed by the Russians. Documents were burned on March 19 and the artillery was destroyed on March 22, and later that same day 119,000 troops surrendered to the Russian forces. Tsar Nicholas II visited the fortress on April 25, 1915 as the Russians adapted it for their purposes. By May 16, however, German forces had reached the fortress, and after laying siege, they captured it on June 5, 1915, led by General von Neussel. Afterwards slight repairs were made. However, the mostly ruined fortifications no longer had serious military significance. They may have been used briefly briefly during the fighting in the course of the Polish-Ukrainian War in the 1920s and very briefly during the Second World War. Gallery.